for them and provide professional development for new and instructional models as well. And finally, employ mastery-based grading so that students are truly ready for the material they're assessed on. And I hope that national leaders can remove the need to cram for high-stakes testing, that they can provide adequate funding so that every school has technology for every student, and we can rethink and revise our factory-based model of education so that students can move at their own speed and learn that in a way that's best for them. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Andy, this is making my math heart so happy. For people who know Andy's work from last year, he was really putting his lens on science, which is wonderful. But to get to hear him like jotting over to math and applying some of the same level of thought to math is really, really awesome to hear. We had a question from Neve early in your presentation, which was kind of asking about the student experience. What was it like for students to be able to access each other's feedback? Did you hear anything from them or observe anything from them around that?
I'm sorry, when you say access their feedback, you mean give feedback to each other?
Yeah, well, when they had access to other people's feedback, and Neve, if you want to clarify that at all, you can as well.
The chart where they saw if they were correct or not, they could also see if other people were correct. So
yeah, like
was there any
everybody's, and I know
the 2 kids that didn't have green, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Oh yeah, it was really cool actually. I have really kind students typically, and so what they were able to see was that they would go and be like, oh, I see you're still on P. Like, what do you need that I can support you so that I can help you get to a complete on this assignment, which I thought was amazing. So it wasn't so much like, oh, haha, you're still on like P, like, no, like you're a little bit behind the rest of us. Like, how can we support you in that? And so that was like, once I saw that and celebrated it, then everyone was like trying to help their friend. And I think I also allowed them to work with friends throughout the whole year. So they were like, I can only work with my friend if they're in the same lesson as me. So I have to help them get to that same lesson so that I can work with my friend. And that was really motivating for them. Great question.
That's awesome. I just want to mention to Sarah that there may be a question about the survey working. We do want to ensure that everyone is able to fill out the feedback form for Andy. So as soon as Sarah is able to pop in a feedback form that works, please make sure that you give Andy some feedback. We have some questions to continue with as we wait for that. An audience member was wondering, were you able to share any of these developments with families?
That's a good question. I haven't yet, to be honest. I mean, I think families knew that we did this learning because this year was difficult and that a lot of students were still learning from home at times. We had a lot of times when you had to say, okay, you're at home for 10 days because of quarantine. And so I think families appreciated using the videos at home. That was really wonderful that they could kind of learn with their child. But outside of like all the different parts of it, I haven't necessarily yet. And so possibly sharing this presentation would help. But yeah, I think this model was great in that families also use the tracker I found to be like, I see my student has a P, how can I help them, catch up to everyone else as well? So kind of like already creates that data point instead of having to create something else to tell them how their student's behind, which was great.
That's awesome. Please do take a look in the Zoom chat. The feedback form is working now, so click the most recent Google form. And Miriam has a hand up. Miriam, want to ask your question live?
Yes, thank you. Andy, first of all, great job. And I had a question about the preparation time for these videos. Like how long does it take? And then do you bundle them do you plan them with the units together, or is it just every single lesson?
Yeah, great question. That was definitely the hardest part of this year, was finding the time to create the videos. And so I would say like, it'd be great if it was created and then could use them year after year if the curriculum doesn't change. But I would bundle them by standard. So if you saw the map, that map was essentially like one standard that students had to master. And so there would be little pieces of blue activities along the way and they would learn a little piece of the standard through maybe 5 or 6 activities within a unit. And then they would hopefully have the standard mastered using a quiz at the end.
And we're going to take one final question. Valerie in the chat asked, did you have students with IEPs in your classroom? And if so, how did you work with them and their learning behavior specialists as you were working with diverse learners?
Yeah, wonderful question. I didn't have any students with IEPs in this focus class that I had the data around, but I did have in my other class, and we used the same type of learning. And so what it was really great I found is working with the co-teacher that I had, is that the videos also allowed her to understand kind of the way that we would be learning the activity within the classroom. And so she was able to watch the videos as well before the lesson, that when they would do it in class, and could better support her students along the way. And she was also able to modify their work, matching the video so that they felt like they had to still do the deep math learning, but kind of a little bit less of some of the things that would take them more time than other students. So it kind of felt like the video supported both the students and the teacher, and there was a richer learning for diverse learners as well.
Well, Andy, thank you so much. Congratulations. And special congratulations on doing this a second time in a row. 2 hard years of education in a row. Your work continues to be inspiring, so thoughtful. So excited to have you in the CFE family doing this work. At this time, we are going to continue to think about equitable access. I think that equitable access to content and conversations with the teacher and each other appeared to be very strong themes in Andy's work, whether he was super explicit about that or not. Our next teacher is being very explicit about what it means to have equity in your classroom, and particularly what is equity of voice. So we are going to go up grade levels to the middle school, and we are going to shift over to the humanities, and we're going to speak with social studies teacher Neve Burke, who is going to share with us her project Equity of Voice in a Post-COVID Classroom. Really excited to hear what you have to share, Neve.
Hello. Hello. Oh, here we go. Oh, yes. Okay. Welcome. So this is the roadmap of my presentation, and this is a little summary of what a cycle of action research entails. Obviously, this step, as Andy pointed out, is actually multiple cycles of question, data analysis, question, data analysis. Here we go. I want to start out with context and positionality. This happened in an 8th grade social studies and civics classroom. Because of a new Illinois state law, 8th graders spend a semester of the year learning civics, which is of course a branch of social studies, but it's explicitly focused on understanding how the government works and how people can participate in our society. I am Neve Burke. I am a partially deaf immigrant, and Erin Gobra. This is my 9th year as an educator, and I love to travel, read books, hang with my pets, whatever your hobby is, tell me about it. I'm interested. I want to do it too. I teach at Sawyer Elementary, which is in Gage Park on the southwest side. We have 1,100 students, and this is actually a reduction since I started working there. It's pre-K through 8th grade. Gage Park is a predominantly Mexican neighborhood, but we do have representation from Honduras, from Guatemala, from Colombia, from Ecuador, from Puerto Rico, a lot of people from Puerto Rico. And it's important to know that even though my school is labeled 41% English language learner, in actuality, the vast majority of students are bilingual. Very few students are only speaking English in the home. So their homes are either Spanish speaking or Spanish and English speaking. The school is 95% low income, so the neighborhood is at least 95% underserved. This is the curriculum that we followed this year. And these are the kind of overarching topics. So for civics, we follow the Participate curriculum, which teaches, like I said, about government and how to interact with the government, how to be a part of society. Choices in Little Rock goes down to Arkansas for the first quarter of social studies in order to look at integration efforts in a Southern high school after Board versus Brown. Reparations 1 is a legally mandated curriculum for 8th graders and high schoolers in Chicago public schools. It's about the Burge torture scandal. If you don't know about it, please read about it, because we should know about it. These are the classes that I had under study. So I studied 4 different classes, and these were 4 different classes I taught social studies and civics too. Just to start off very briefly, these 2 classes were real polar opposites in terms of classroom culture. And I think you're going to see that a little bit later when I show you some data. This group, for example, in their contract at the beginning of the year, wrote as number 1 thing, we will respect other people's beliefs, opinions, gender, sexuality, etc. Whereas this group in their class contract at the beginning of the year had trouble agreeing to, I will try to do all the learning activities. That was not something they could commit to. And then this class down here was a kind of a mix. It was a mix of, there was a lot of quiet, kind of studious people. And then there was a lot of big personalities. They liked to have a good time. They did enjoy learning, but if they were bored, they were going to let you know. I want to acknowledge that this is some deficit language about this class, but it's very challenging to kind of process this class. One of my colleagues, I got the word from a colleague who said, in my 22 years of teaching, I've never seen a whole class that's so apathetic. For example, only 2/3 of the class was able to participate in graduation. And that really affected how they interacted with some of these activities that I implemented for this project. So this is my rationale, an overview of some of it. I'm not going to dive too deeply here. So if you have some questions, please drop them in the chat. But I do want to highlight that a major part of this project came out of Diana Hess's work about controversy in the classroom and the importance of, in social studies, giving students a chance to talk about open issues that are challenging, that have multiple perspectives, and that will cause disagreement in your room. So it's an important part of civics and social studies education. And I think we all live in this country and we can all understand why. So these were my research questions. I'm going to stop for a moment to just give you a chance to read them. But mostly I wanted to investigate what happens when we try to build equity of voice in a civics and social studies classroom. I did this in my research primarily by looking at how students interacted in whole group settings of discussion, but that was not the end all be all of the project. So I'm going to lead you through some of my data and findings and as it relates back to those questions that I introduced. So if you didn't have a chance to read all the questions, they're coming back up. I collected data with 4 main methods. I also kept a teacher journal, which I won't be presenting to you, just like Andy, but I will be sharing with you some results from my discussion survey, some of the results from my community circle data, and some of the results from my content discussion protocol data. So one of the major ways that I implemented my project is I tried several different discussion routines and protocols to see how students reacted. And they can be broadly separated into 2 groups. Community circle was all student-led. It's more of an SEL activity, whereas my content-based discussion protocols are designed to help you teach controversial issues in a responsible, ordered, structured way. And there was several different versions of those. Community circles were not graded, content discussion protocols were graded, and that did affect my data. So I want to start off with the discussion surveys, because one of the things I wanted to know is what happens about students' attitudes towards equity of voice when we're trying to build equity of voice. So in my surveys that I administered 3 times, they questioned students' attitudes towards the discussion as well as their experiences with discussion. I'm going to go ahead and show you. So my hypothesis was that students did not like whole group discussion, and boy, was I right. So you can tell here, this was the scale, not comfortable at all, I hate it, to very comfortable, I love it. Almost no one feels very comfortable speaking the whole group at the beginning of the year. This was not shocking and kind of also provided me with evidence of why this work was important, because in our lives, in our job markets, we have to be able to communicate and discuss in a variety of settings, and sometimes that's in front of a large group of people. In February, you'll notice there was this kind of slight shift here towards the center. Oops. See, which was encouraging and really, encouraged me to keep going with what I was trying with these discussion protocols, because I believe that that is what led to this growing comfort. And by the end of the year, still there's a lot down here and there's little up here, but there is more of a shift into the center, which, like I said, was also very encouraging. So I want to touch back on these two questions as I talk to you about my analysis. So first of all, one of the things that happens is that attitudes towards whole group discussion change slowly. And this is kind of that fact for that question led me to start thinking about how my own attitudes towards equity of voice needed to change, because some people still don't like speaking in front of a whole group. But as other parts of my data will show you, that's okay sometimes. It's okay that students don't feel the most comfortable because there's other benefits to this work. So next I want to talk to you about community circles. Like I said, students chose topics. They were ungraded, although one class, my 111, the students who kind of really felt uncomfortable sharing out, they did ask to be graded. I'm going to show you a very brief part of this community circle. I'm sorry, the sound is not great, but let's try it. Sorry.
Want to say that every once in a while,
That's not
I
what I
don't
wanna
get
show
the
you,
lecture,
sorry.
we'll see people eating. I'm gonna do that right
Right, so I just wanted to give you a little bit of a taste of what community circle looked like. Oops, that's not what I meant to do, sorry. Okay, so then the data that I'm about to show you again goes back to the question about which protocols help me motivate and encourage students to engage, and how does my understanding of equity of voice change? So first of all, I expected community circles to be much more engaging for students than the content-based protocols, because the content-based protocols I'm choosing, whereas in community circle, they choose whatever topic they want to talk about. So sometimes they're talking about their hair, they're talking about tests, they're talking about things that they don't like, they're talking about their favorite magic power, if they could have one. And this wasn't necessarily true. Students shared out equally or less than they did in a content-based discussion protocol. I also learned that in every class, a smaller subset of students shared out more often and more regularly across time. And also, I really started to question myself through community circles is, what does equity of voice actually mean? Because initially I had this idea that if it was equity of voice, everyone had an equal opportunity to participate. And I didn't think that everyone would participate in equal amount, but I thought maybe everyone would participate if there was true equity of voice. But in reality, that's not what happened in any of my classes. So it really, makes me think about how I need to shift some of the biases I'm bringing into my students' room. Next, I want to talk to you a little bit about the content-based discussion protocols. There was 4 different kinds that I implemented. The first 2 on this side, I don't know if you can see my cursor on the left, are Socratic Seminar philosophical chairs. These are great for controversial issues. The 2 on the right are democratic simulations of real problems that also allow you to talk about controversial issues. These were the concepts. They came from either current events, they came from the curriculum, or at the end of the year, they also came from the students themselves. Students would say, hey, can we talk about this? Could we do one of these? And this was another way that equity of voice started to pop up For example, I talked to one student about when the abortion stuff started happening. I was talking to a student about, I want to address this in class. You know, this is what I'm thinking. I don't know which would be best, this or this or this. And they were like, you know what, those are great ideas, but I think the moot court would be the most relevant way because it made sense. We were talking about Supreme Court law, so of course. But it allowed students to start taking more ownership in the room as well. So this data goes back to these 3 questions that I've been thinking about with the community circles as well. And what I found is that over time, if you repeat a structure or protocol, students become much more comfortable. And you can see that in almost every class. 3 out of 4 showed a general uptick, although 103's data was a little bit confusing. And I think, again, that ties back to the classroom culture. And then the other thing I really discovered is that equity of voice doesn't necessarily mean equal, and which I knew that, but also different students will step into different roles. And not that it's not our responsibility to push students to master all aspects of discussion, but some students feel more comfortable questioning. Some students want to share their opinion. Some students like to, you know, come back to that text 4 or 5 times. So that's a very interesting thing that also caused me to question about what is equity of voice and how do I measure it? Because it ended up being more messy than I realized. And then here's some of my findings from the discussion routine data. So I'm just showing you one classes, which was kind of all over the place. And that helped me show when I compared it to other classes that there's not a single protocol or topic that guarantees participation in all the classes. So it really makes you think about kind of what Andy was saying, this one size fit all curriculum. We do this lesson on this day, and how that doesn't necessarily work for all students, because even within the same school, the same context, the classes are vastly different. Also, it allowed me to see one of the things that happened was different students and different classes came up with their own different types of equity of voice. Or sorry, came up with their own protocols to help with equity of voice. So 101 actually used some of their protocols from Community Circle and brought them into the Socratic seminar. And by doing this, they allowed each person to have a more of an opportunity to participate, even if they wanted to, even though not every student did. And they also made the grading more equal because every student had an equal amount of chances to participate. So students had an opportunity to earn the grade that they wanted because grades were linked to your contribution. And then some more findings. This is 102's discussion data. And as you see, it starts off really good in the beginning of the year. They're like, oh, we gotta do what our teacher says. And then it kind of drops down and then it builds back up again. And I really have to say what made this class so successful. I think it goes back to that classroom culture that I mentioned at the beginning of the year. It kind of underscores that to do any of these things, to be able to talk about controversial issues, the groundwork has to be laid first, so that those conversations are productive. And it also reveals a limitation on my research because I was just tracking who participated. I tracked what they said. I tracked what kind of comment they made, but their grades were not based on the quality of their contribution. It was just graded. It was a participation grade. How much did you participate? And in the future, a next step would be, how do I encourage more of this higher level of discourse like I saw in room 102? I want to show you a little bit of this. I'm running out of time and the audio is real bad, but it shows the Socratic seminar. It's a fishbowl. You'll see more about that later in this day, so I'll leave that to Nate. Okay. So then I want to come back here at the end to those discussion protocols, because even though the majority of students said that they were uncomfortable with discussion, the amount of students, another question on the survey was, tell me about a time that discussion had been useful. And in the beginning of the year, the majority of responses kind of referenced a specific referenced a specific concept that we had covered in class, but 27 students had said referenced a specific protocol. By the end of the year, there was 50-ish students who referenced a specific protocol when they were discussing a time discussion was useful. And that was almost half of this, that was more than half of the students that I had interviewed. So it really kind of made me think back to that question of what happens is that sometimes students need to be pushed into areas of being uncomfortable. All of these quotes that I selected here are by students who put in the survey that they did not like participating in whole group discussion, yet you can see by their comments that they appreciated it and they found it useful to their overall learning. Another student towards the end of the year was like, this is my favorite class. And I was like, oh, really? And he goes, yeah, only when we do fishbowl and moot courts and stuff, that's what I like. And this was a student who in the beginning and middle of the year shared out rarely or sometimes only for a grade. But in the last 2 months of data collection, he shared out pretty much every time. So it's important that teachers kind of create space for that and push students out of their comfort zone within reason. A final thing that I want to share is, sorry, just checking my time, is while I was doing this research, a colleague of mine was discussing, we were talking about our art curriculum and our arts integration, which was a different project, but she said, I just want to advocate for the quiet students, the shy students, those who just want to observe, because they are important witnesses, and witnesses is a type of participation. And this, you know, it was a real light bulb moment hearing that, because this was this person completely unconnected to this project that was kind of teaching me a little bit about how my own understanding needed to shift and how I was kind of bringing in my own biases about what equity was, and maybe not giving enough space to the quiet students, the shy students, and the observing students. The last question that I haven't touched much about, because I didn't do a lot of research, I didn't focus my research on these things, but my classroom was not only about whole group discussion. Students also had peer-to-peer discussion every day. They had writing pretty much every day. We did a lot of small group. We had routines relating to small group discussions. We did arts integration, and we had several inquiry projects to synthesize and culminate with their learning, and students had a lot of choice in choosing how to represent their learning. And this is very important because without having varied means of assessment, you will not be able to build the buy-in that when you're asking students to do something that makes them uncomfortable, for them to trust you. But if you have a more balanced menu for them throughout your quarter, throughout your lessons, they're more willing to try out these things that they're a little iffy about. My policy recs and next steps. On a school level, teachers need dedicated planning time to address speaking and listening. It's kind of the stepchild of our grade books. We receive very little PD and planning time and vertical articulation time. At a district level, I would love districts to set aside more time and money for professional learning communities. I think this process of action research has been incredibly beneficial to my teaching and my students, and it was only possible because I was able to self-select the topics I was interested in studying and have a council of collaborators that helped me do this. At a national level, hearkening back to the controversial issues, we need to teach the truth, and we can't shy away from difficult conversations. We need to give students the tools necessary to examine multiple perspectives and address the legacy of white supremacy in our country, and create a more unified country that is a safe and free place for all of us. These are my next steps. I really want to do a little bit more work to measure how much time I'm spending on stage, kind of like Andy, and I want to increase opportunities for student voice in my classroom throughout all steps of my planning and implementation. And I want to create more feedback routines around speaking and listening so that students can set goals and track progress over time. And thank you so much. Question time.
Neve, I'm going to email you and ask for all of these resources to share with the social studies and humanities and science and math teachers at my school. But I immediately thought of all three of my social studies teachers and I was like, yes, I want to send this. Thank you. This is awesome. I think a really important first question from an audience member was, why was equity of voice so important to you to begin with? You said that getting an opportunity to dig into what's important to you is really necessary in these professional learning communities. Why this one?
Okay, that's a great question. I'm just going back to my rationale slide because I really hopped over it. So there's a lot of professional reasons, like this is my social studies reason. Can you see my pointer?
Yes.
Excellent. So this is my social studies reasoning. This is my professional reasoning because I teach ELL students. This is my reasoning because students just spent a year and a half not talking to each other, not being around each other, and they needed a lot of support with like learning how to do school and learning how to interact. On a personal level, I think that a huge reason for this is I am partially deaf, and I actually only got hearing aids about 5 years ago. So getting the hearing aids has really, and just getting confirmation that I have a hearing issue, it's made me completely rethink about how conversations work. And it's become a little micro obsession in my whole life that's kind of bled into teaching because, as you see, it's very connected.
Thank you. Thank you for digging a little bit more into that for us. I really appreciate it. I have a question around surprise, because I think that you told us about some of the ways you want to unpack your own biases around what it means to be sharing in a verbal classroom. And you also shared those 4 words that you would use to describe your cohorts. And I really appreciated that right away. You mentioned some of the deficit language that even came out in how we might describe the cohorts of students that we work with. So with all of that in mind, what was your biggest surprise? Either about a whole group, about an individual? What really struck you that's going to go away in the future with you?
I think what really struck me the most, the biggest surprise, was how vastly different the classes were. And, like they're kids from the same neighborhood. They've been going to school together for years. A lot of them have similar cultural and ethnic backgrounds. They have similar language. But the atmosphere of each class was so different. And as a teacher, it was a nice little controlled experiment because sometimes you really question yourself. Like I've taught all subjects, but when you have 4 different classes and you have students that are equally intelligent and equally capable, but you have such a vast difference in how they perform. That was just kind of a surprise, and I'm not really done unpacking that and like understanding how I need to adjust myself for different classes more. Yeah, sorry, that's just something I'm really thinking about. But that was definitely shocking because they were just so disparate, the results from the different classes.
Sounds like you have some more action research to do next year. That's always the most addictive way to end an action research project. I'd like to open the floor up to anyone who is interested in sharing their question out loud.
Thank you, Valerie. Thank you, everyone in the chat. And if you have questions, feel free to,
Hey, great job with the presentation. How do you think results might change next academic year if you were to do the same thing over? And I say this, coming off of these past 2 years into this as we transition back into school, but after 1 full school year of in person again.
I think that's a great question. And I assume it will, the 2 classes I struggled with the most, 111 and 103, for different reasons. I think that next year will be much improved because they have, sorry about that, they have had this whole year that, like 103 complained all year, like this, why do we have to do this? This is boring, blah, blah, blah. And it's kind of like they really needed to get used to school again. And I think some students spent a year and a half not participating. They didn't log into the meets. They didn't participate in chat. They didn't complete a single assignment. And it's kind of like when school was back in session, some students didn't believe that they had to do the work, you know, and it's 8th grade, it's a benchmark year. We're telling them like, these are the promotion, there's a promotion policy this year. Last year there wasn't. So it's kind of like some kids didn't believe that they had to do it or they were not going to graduate. And next year, the kids will know like, oh, there are 8th graders who had to go to summer school. I don't want that. So I think that'll overall, there will be a more rigorous attitude towards school than there was this year. Granted, I think the purpose of this year was more SEL, like how do we make kids feel comfortable? How do we address their social emotional needs? But I'm hoping for improvement because this year was hard.
Thank you for that question, Alexander. And Neve, thank you so much for sharing. It was really cool to see both what the students were getting out of it and also the ways that you were unpacking your own kind of questions and wondering around the work. So thank you. As a reminder to all of us, there is very rarely a package that we can tie up neatly with a bow. And so when you're left with more of these questions, that's really awesome. And also just really cool things happening in your space. Very exciting. Thank you so much. Let's give you another round of applause. All right. At this time, we are halfway through our fantastic group of fellows for this evening, and we are going to move into the arts space. I'm really looking forward to hearing about Aoko Omwani Hope's work. She is an arts liaison who is going to be sharing about, it sounds like choice and student personalism in an arts classroom. And her presentation is Here I Am, Cultivating Culture Through Art. Go ahead, we're really excited.
Thank you, Kate. I will now share my screen. Here. Okay, are we good?
Yes.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Aoko Omwani Hope, and I'd like to thank you for joining me today. I'm grateful to have this opportunity to share with you my research project, Cultivating Culture Through Art. I teach at James R. Doolittle Elementary School, located in Bronzeville, and where the largest demographic is Black and makes up 100% of the student population. There are 208 students enrolled at the school. Low-income students make up 95% of the population, and 11% are diverse learners. We serve families from the surrounding housing developments, mainly the Lawless Gardens. Bronzeville itself is about 9 miles south of the Loop. It has a rich history dating back to the Great Black Migration of the 1920s and 60s, through 60s, and became known as the Black Metropolis in the early 20th century because it was such a vibrant community and rich in the arts and literature. Because of its rich history, Bronzeville has landmark status. Stories of Black Chicago started here. It's home to the first Black art museum called the Southside Art Center. Although the history has made it somewhat of a tourist attraction, the community still has pockets of crime, violence, and vacant lots. In fact, Doolittle serves kids whose families aren't really a part of the gentrification that's happening. As I stated earlier, the majority of our students live in the Lawless Gardens right here, which are federally subsidized. Our students face challenges stemming from low socioeconomic status, domestic violence, community violence, and adverse health outcomes. To mitigate this, the school is organized with many layers of social and emotional support, responsive to the chronic needs of the families we serve. We have a full-time social worker who provides grief and general counseling, along with groups of interns from Adler University, who work with smaller groups of students. Social services and behavioral health are provided by the Ada McKinley Community Services and Communities in Schools. The behavioral health team, which is composed of administrators, teachers, and support staff, are working on incorporating more trauma-informed practices. Unlike my students, I have been privileged as a Kenyan born into a two-parent, art-supporting, middle-class family. And I'd like to share a little bit about how that has played a role in this research. I received a Catholic education under the British system before moving to America to attend art school for both undergrad and graduate degrees. I grew up in Nairobi, a cosmopolitan city where the official language is English. Although there is ethnic diversity, I primarily spoke English at home, and to a lesser degree, my home language of Luo and the national language Kiswahili. With this upbringing, I have navigated the American college with relative success. However, the gap between how I grew up and was educated and how my students experienced schooling has always been important in considering how to reconcile the complexities of being ethnic and Black in America. In assimilating to American culture, this complexity plays a role in how I view students, their families, how I interact with them, and the expectations I have for norms of social behavior which guide everything we do in schools. Since my identity as a Kenyan American in relation to my students' culture is somewhat of a gray area, I am always examining how my beliefs, values, and educational experiences that make up my identity might be impacting them. If left unchecked, I know that my implicit bias could potentially hinder the educational progress of Doolittle students. My teaching experience has mostly been in Chicago high schools in the areas of biology and visual art. For this research to move forward, it was important for me to investigate my own pedagogy, how I approach curriculum, and my expectations, all of which stem from everything I have described to you thus far. As a coworker once told me when I was struggling, I needed to reimagine and retool how to better reach students. And this research project has brought that to fruition. I'd like to briefly describe how I learned art. I've always been curious, analytical, and hands-on. By high school, it was obvious to my parents and teachers that I was destined to be an artist. My arts training consisted of studio production and pencil shading. That's all we did. My teacher made us draw from observation to create the likeness of a given subject. They stressed the technical side of art and expected me to do scientific drawings by 10th grade. We would revisit shading techniques every year and had to copy the styles of the upperclassmen. In the US, I majored in textile design and specialized in fiber art in graduate school, where I was confronted with a looser and much more expressive drawing style that I have embraced and carried into my teaching. I've had to curtail some of my technical tendencies in elementary school teaching. For example, when a student asked me how to wash out paintbrushes, which I thought she knew how to do, I was shocked to learn that she didn't know how to. In the aftermath of remote instruction and hybrid learning in the 2021 school year, my pedagogy was changing. I was curious about why some strategies and innovations that I was toying with were actually working for students. What I did differently was to offer choice in activities and art mediums, and I revamped structures such as whole group instruction. To give you some background, in choice-based learning, you're using centers and choices to support students in coming up with their own ideas of art, and you're helping them to envision the end product. It facilitates differentiation, which easily accommodates a variety of types of learners. As I was experimenting and engaging students, I crafted a tool that I called a scorecard to manage and account for student work and their choices. The scorecard worked really, really well during hybrid learning because the number of students who used it, since they were in the building, in the spring of 2021 was very, very small. I noticed that they worked independently, rotating through various art processes and mediums, while I facilitated remote instruction for students learning at home. I continued using the scorecard in the fall of 2021 with mixed results. Consequently, I wanted to refine my teaching with a new methodology because I knew it was working. I was wondering what it was specifically that made students find greater enjoyment in art class than the previous year. So I gave a broad baseline survey, which asked students, rank your level of interest in 2D, 3D, art criticism, art history. What materials do you like to use? How creative do you feel you are? And just a side note, I chose sixth graders because they were a class that seemed to really enjoy art, and I felt less resistance from them than the other classes. And here are some samples. This led me to develop sub-questions in response to the survey results and prior knowledge of what my students needed. I wanted to find out, how do students interact with art out of school? How do they demonstrate the creation process in an art class? What mediums and topics inspire their art? And finally, how is my own teaching of art evolving? My research question was, what happens when I cultivate an appreciation for culture using choice-based arts learning with sixth graders? For my methodology, I implemented choice-based learning strategically across a range of themes such as art processes, materials and techniques, social and emotional learning, and culturally responsive teaching practice areas. I collected data via weekly exit tickets, my teacher journal, through student art, and parent surveys. Parent surveys were taken from responses in December, March, and April. The exit ticket in particular was a tool that evolved as I was always adjusting and shifting to what students would say after each art lesson. Throughout the year, I would read snippets of my journal in class and share the exit ticket data with the class. Before we look at the data, you'll need to know a little bit about what I'm calling the creation process. The creation process can be described as the way ideas and creative thinking comes about. The experience of making art and exploring materials. It usually begins with gathering some inspiration and ends with a finished product. And it happens during drawing, painting, printmaking, and sculpting. And what you're looking at here is me dabbling in some printmaking. Part of the creative process depends on how students respond to art. And I decided to incorporate this as I developed lessons and activities in order to answer my sub-questions and based on student responses in the survey. Here are two student-facing examples of what responding in art means. Student says, I love learning more about the artist Judith Scott and the work they made with stuff like cotton and string. Here, the student points out how the artist, Judith Scott, interacted with mediums when he says she does things with cotton and string. For meaning making, I had my students respond to what they thought a muralist who was in our building at the time meant in their work. If this artwork could talk, it would say, I am Black, I am proud to be Black, I am a leader and a creator. We say love and we're proud to be in love. I'm a dramatic person. From these types of experiences, students began to relate different ideas to develop meaning in their own work. In February, the class learned about Judith Scott, a fiber sculptor who was deaf and had Down syndrome. When asked what was enjoyable about the lesson, AG, who made the bunny, had this to say: I enjoyed every part of it, except waiting for their turn with the glue gun. It was a fun project. So my first sub-questions, I wanted to know how students interacted with art when they were out of school, given that they live in Bronzeville. In total, I surveyed about 9 parents 3 times a year, twice virtually, and once in person during PT conferences. I made selections to get information from a broad spectrum of students, parents of children who were new to Doolittle, talented in art, engaged in the class, or not interested at all. Here's what I asked and found. Is there anything I should know about student that would help me grow his or her interests in art? He draws to calm himself down. He hasn't been drawing as much. He's been playing video games. She loves anime. She shows me what she's drawing. Her wall is covered with her drawings. She's the only child, so art helps her. Parent two, sorry. Oops. Uh-oh, okay. We'll just skip that. Okay, so my findings. I found that there is support for artistic endeavors, right? But there's a limited awareness of how to actually incorporate art into real life, be it through museums or community events. Most parents don't have enough knowledge or experience with that option, and I saw this in the way they responded to the question. Most of them described art's processes, which is what I would expect. What I didn't hear were parents talking about how they expose their children to art through books, trips, or how they themselves nurture it in their children. This is sort of in opposition to the fact that they live in this vibrant community with a rich artistic history that I outlined earlier. Parents were very willing to participate in the research, and I hope to work with them as partners by maybe making art alongside their child. One drawback was that I couldn't get all parents involved all 3 times, and that would be December, March, and April. How do students demonstrate the creation process in an art class? In this lesson, students chose 3 words to describe the emotions they were feeling during that time. They picked from an emotion and feeling wheel, created a painting based on their choice, then answered questions on an exit ticket. 64% of students had positive things to say about how they felt as they worked demonstrating that SEL activities were very well received. This was a positive experience for the majority of students. And in their own words, they were surprised, happy, or reminded of themselves. Here, I just want to give you a snapshot of the emotion wheel that I was referring to and the end products, a sampling of the end products. I would add that students have art for 1 hour twice a week. So I would consider these to be rough drafts or plans for more involved pieces. In another lesson, students responded to the concept of cultural collision. They listened to a Nigerian-American artist, Jideka Akunyili Crosby, talk about her work and how she uses art to interrogate her cross-cultural identity. They then chose an example of cultural collision from a list and created a work based on their selection. Like the emotion wheel, the majority of students found this way of coming up with a creative idea to be positive. It was peaceful. They expressed themselves. They got inspired by looking at other art, and it was enjoyable. Here's what NG said in his end of year reflection. I love learning more about the artists, of me, and the work they made, like masks and paint. And of course, he's referring to himself. And that is his piece to the right. And now let's listen to what one student had to say about the creation process.
So just a piece of the Black Lives Matter color. It's about the culture, the Black lives. Then look at the moment, I ain't have an idea about Black people's lives. And I knew that was the color and the stuff. So
What
that's why
does it mean to you? What are you trying to say to your audience? To the people we're looking at. Why?
There's a lot of good stuff in there you need to know about people like you.
There's people like me?
Yeah.
Because I'm from where? Is that why you need to learn? Okay. Anything else you want to say about what art means to you?
So just a piece of the Black Lives Matter color.
I'm stuck. Anyone give me a tip on how to get out of this? And back to my presentation.
Try pressing escape on your keyboard.
Thank you, Neve.
So
My
just
apologies.
a piece of
There we are. Artists aren't perfect. Okay, so my findings would indicate that students demonstrate the creative process when given the option to choose art mediums and processes, and when they can express themselves through themes relating to themselves and to Blackness. In her year-end survey, JM said, "I love learning more about the artists Dijeka, Akunyili, Crosby, and the work they made like culture painting." What mediums and topics inspire student art? For this lesson, I showed a quick video on Dariel Vasquez, chosen because of his youth and his message about belonging. I thought my students could connect to him. Students then had the freedom to create what they wanted, and I offered masks as an option. Most of them chose to paint masks, and a much smaller number picked drawing, or for that matter, coloring. In all, I found that students gravitated towards the mediums that were, quote unquote, forgiving, easy to manipulate, or where they could get a do-over, like with fibers and hair, paint, beads, hot glue, tape. In contrast, drawing is a much more precise activity. It's a skill, in fact. Students tend to want to get it right the first time, and it is by no stretch forgiving. By introducing them to these various approaches and mediums, I'm hoping they find a way of creating art that speaks to them. This is how I developed my own artistic voice, although later in life, when I went on to art school. As for topics, students did not get as much out of drawing anime eyes as they did discussing culture. And so these graphs just illustrate some of the responses that I got from the exit ticket. And the question I asked them is, what does the piece mean to you? And would you like to repeat this lesson to show, to give me an indication of whether or not they were engaged in the topic? As you can see, there were some negative responses there. How is my teaching of art evolving? As I look at the paintings, I'm even more convinced that art for my sixth graders is a form of exploration. The imagery and their approach is so subjective. I'm also reminded that many of my students don't or won't draw. So oftentimes they paint spontaneously, blending and splattering colors. And that would show that. This is an example of how I was building my own awareness, awareness of the need for exploration into culturally responsive teaching. The collage, I shifted it also in how I related to my students. And here's a reading or a quote or finding that speaks to that. The collage project was a hit. DW had made a sample several weeks ago, so I asked her to lead the lesson. She was elated. After the critique on Chicago murals, I passed out slime and sat down with the girls for the first time this school year. It was fun to just sit and talk to them, be near them, and watch them dabble in slime. All of a sudden, AH began talking about what happened with her sister and a second grade girl. She rambled and rambled. She stayed after class and continued. Usually she's quiet and only speaks when I'm near her. So slime is a great way to connect with kids. While the impetus, this finding shows that I was able to connect with AH, who is disinterested in art. And I did this by splitting her attention between talking and manipulating slime. And this allowed her to be a lot more expressive. While the impetus for the research project was on studio production, the project brought new understandings in how to build stronger relationships. It grew my own capacity to enlist parents as partners in supporting arts learning while shining a light on the discrepancies of arts learning at home. Recommendations. I recommend journaling as a means of self-assessment. Unlike the common practice of doing it all at the end of the year for reach evaluations, writing about teaching practice can reveal so much about student learning as it is actually happening. Incorporate student reflection into creative practice, that is, in visual art, music, dance, and theater education. Student comments during and after art making are building blocks. Their words can help teachers to develop more personalized and engaging art curriculum. At the school level, districts can support art teachers by offering PD on the ways to incorporate social and emotional learning into arts teaching. Too often, SEL is interpreted as a way to just manage a class. But teachers really need training on how to honor, for one, student identity, so that students themselves see themselves in the curriculum. At the district level, creating more equitable opportunities for families to experience the arts, especially in low-income community, where there's an immediate and necessary next step. This is an immediate and necessary next step. Families need support and outreach in order to access all that the city, let alone Bronzeville, has to offer. Building arts awareness has benefits to students both in and out of the classroom, as shown by this research. In closing, I'd like to share with you a quote from the researcher, Zaretta Hammond, that summarizes my entire journey this year. Culturally responsive teachers have to understand their own cultural reference points to be effective. And this video clip will answer the research question, what does happen when an appreciation for culture is purposely cultivated through choice-based arts learning with sixth graders? You'll need to use all your senses to take this in.
I'm gonna write to the ground. Why you going for the hard? Right. It's working this whole. Why didn't you just give me a Sharpie? He tired of what? I'm so weird. Like 12, he looks 16. He turned 12. I forgot y'all, y'all owe me a letter. You are. You still here, bro?
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions.
Please, let's give Aoka a round of applause. That is so cool. I assume I'm probably not alone in wishing that I both had that art experience when I was in middle school and that I could have that art experience at my current middle school. You are an inspiration, the work that you do. For everybody, as we start asking questions, please take a look at the Zoom chat. Sarah has put a feedback form in so that you can give Aoko some feedback. You did so much in reaching out to students and to families to get information. that would help you in the space. We have a question from the audience about how you might in the future reach out to families to see if you can bring their expertise in the space. Wondering, do you know if any of the families of your students are artists? And are you interested in reaching out to them in different ways in the future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And actually the answer is yes, I have already done that. As students are working, I do always, inquire casually about whether or not, their parents are artists. I see them in the building. And some of them have actually volunteered that information. So we do an annual arts fair at the end of the year. And so we're putting on our third art fair this upcoming school year. And so my goal is to actually have sort of a workshop style fair where students and families can, join each other in making art. But also on an ongoing basis, I'm always asking parents to come in and do presentations or workshops. And I think because, again, we're just coming out of the pandemic, I haven't had as much, as much response, but it's definitely something that's on my radar. Thank you for the question.
That's really cool. I have a question. As you're thinking about this as just generally a leader in, supporting arts in the city, what would be your recommendations for teachers who are not art teachers per se, but interested in incorporating more arts or the benefit of arts into their classrooms? Any like low stakes ways that teachers could start to implement this in their work?
Yeah, so, I really would suggest or recommend just have non-contingent conversations in your building. I think that's where it starts, hey, I'm doing this project, can we work together? So I think if there's a lot more of, I guess, what we call horizontal alignment, where teachers are talking across grade levels, across subject areas, if there were more of those conversations happening to begin with, I think from there, efforts to maybe do lesson unit plans together. But I think for the most part, it involves partnership. I mean, math, I wouldn't know where to start. If you told me, let's integrate math into art, I just look at you cross-eyed. So, I think that, we all want to do great work. We all want to support our kids. And I think too often we work in silos. So breaking down some of those silos could help support the arts and teachers with arts anxiety.
Thank you. And there is an ARLI fellow from 4, 5, 6 years ago, maybe 5 years ago at this point, who did look at incorporating arts into a math class. So that definitely speaks to those opportunities. A related question from an audience member was around co-teaching for this. So in addition to having those conversations that might inspire someone to do that work, do you see opportunities for how you could be 2 teachers in the classroom facilitating that work? Have you done that kind of work? Would you like to? What could that look like?
Haven't done co-teaching. I have had a teacher assistant, in fact, this whole entire school year. And I think that's a great idea. 2 adults are always better than 1. It's more eyes on the classroom. And that's something that I sort of would have to think about. Sort of, first of all, what is their skill set? What are they good at? And then from there, kind of, just work again on some co-planning. But never thought about it, never had it, would love to have it.
You hear that, all these teachers? You can go find a co-teacher in Aoko in the future. I would like to open the floor up to people who would like to ask their questions out loud. We have someone with their hand up. And can you pronounce your name for us as well? Thank you.
Sure. My name is Janya, and I just wanted to say I really like the presentation. And I guess I have more of a comment than a question. I love the introduction that included the information about Bronzeville, as it's almost like it's an identity itself, as like these kids live in this great neighborhood that has this rich history. And it's something that I think is very salient to me right now as we hear about policies and curfews and stuff for kids and everything. So I'm wondering, I guess, do you have any plans to incorporate the neighborhood's identity more into your classroom, because it sounds like there's a lot of art that is just around the kids. And you know, like I feel like that's so important and so lucky for them to have such a rich environment in which to start to explore their artistic identity. And again, I loved everything that I saw. Great job.
Thank you, Janya. I really appreciate your feedback. And I do agree with you that I need to tap into Bronzeville itself. I think, you know, it hasn't happened just because of logistics and, you know, coming off of a pandemic. I'm also my third year at Doolittle, completed my third year. But some ideas I would have would just be connecting with what's already there, the Southside Arts, Southside Community Arts Center, and some of the just the surrounding, you know, arts related activities. I know we do partner with Organic Oneness, which is an arts partner in Bronzeville, and they actually sponsored the painting of the mural. So, you know, again, it starts with conversations and just reimagining, retooling, reframing. So yeah, that's a great point though.
Thank you so much for your questions, and Aoko, thank you for your work. Another round of applause, please.
Thank you.
Ooh, is anybody else leaving being like, man, I almost wish it weren't the last day of school. So many cool things I want to implement. Every teacher's like, no, man, I'm ready for 2 months of summer. Let's have that. But we have one more presentation that is going to inspire us for when we come back next year. Maybe Nate is saying that he is ready for, is that fingers crossed you want to have 2 more months of summer, or fingers crossed you want to teach right away?
I mean, fingers crossed this is inspiring, Kate. Like, we'll see how it goes.
We're going to raise the bar that high, because, you know, the more we raise the bar, the more people reach it, right? We got a taste of Socratic seminars from Neve's presentation. And I think it's really awesome that we get a chance to hear from 2 social studies civics teachers, 8th grade teachers, around getting students talking, because I can only imagine how awesome your conversations during the ARLI process must have been. I feel very fortunate that we get an opportunity to hear what it sounds like now on the other end. So please give it up for our final presenter of the evening, Nate Raymond, who is going to share with us his work on Socratic seminars.
All right, thanks, Kate. Hey, y'all. Wow, it's good to see all of you tonight in this imaginative space with us. I feel like as the last guy here coming up, or the last person coming up in this whole ARLI presentation, I'd like to just take a second to say just both how intimidating, but how inspiring it was to work with such wonderful educators throughout the whole year. Like this ARLI fellowship was really a gift in that respect. You know, Katie, Miriam, Dion, Melissa, Andy, Neve, and Aoko are just some of the most incredible people doing this work, and to follow them is just an honor. I need to just be very thankful for Deb for being our guide throughout this whole process. None of this gets done without your work, Deb. And also just Sarah for all of the work behind the scenes. Again, none of this gets done without your work. And thanks, Kate, for being our awesome MC today. Whew. Okay, all right, let's find this. It's here somewhere. Okay, all right, so again, my name's Nate Raymond. I'm a middle school social studies teacher at Mitchell Elementary in Chicago's Ukrainian Village neighborhood. My presentation is called Democratizing the Democratic Classroom, Making Civics Student-Centered Through Socratic Seminar. Let's hit it. All right, so first off, I want to tell you a little bit about my teaching context. Mitchell is an intentionally small school. It actually became a little smaller over the course of the pandemic. Most years we have about 400 students. We've got 368 this year. Like I said, we're in Ukrainian Village. It's a historic home to immigrant communities from Eastern Europe and Latin America. But more recently, the neighborhood has rapidly gentrified. And all this means that our student body is racially and economically diverse, as you can see from the charts that are on this slide. These factors certainly influenced my research topic, but they weren't the only things that had me thinking this school year. Let's dig a little deeper into my project rationale here. So I've always been a civics guy. For whatever reason, the subject has followed me wherever I go, starting with my first assignment teaching AP US government and politics at a West Side high school. And honestly, it's been one of the happiest accidents of my life. I love working with kids, getting them helping them understand like how this crazy country of ours works and hopefully making it better for the future. When I moved from high school to middle school, I joined a group of teachers who were piloting and revising a new 8th grade civics course for Chicago Public Schools. Civics, you see, is traditionally very teacher directed, and the new curriculum hoped to change that. When I say teacher directed, I'm talking about instruction that's focused on lecture and note taking, along with independent work and some informal group activities. In short, students just respond to the teacher. As I taught my 8th graders during Q1, I noticed that even with the new curriculum, I saw lower engagement than in my 7th grade class, which is built around an inquiry model. I really needed to make civics more student-centered. And in a student-centered class, a problem drives each lesson, students identify solutions, and the teacher facilitates. So both the students and their teacher respond to each other and to the problem. So I decided to ask students a question to see how they thought class was going, and here it is. That's right. What can Mr. Raymond do to improve your experience in civics? Be as specific as you can. And they were. This is just a selection of responses, but they do hit on some common themes students brought up. They wanted more choice in what and how we learned, along with the ability to work more with their peers. Most importantly for me, students asked for a chance to talk more about important issues facing our society. And these statements really got me thinking. I'd been using a practice with my 7th graders all year called Socratic Seminar. They loved it. It gave them a way to get involved in class every day and placed ownership of our class in the hands of the students, which leads me straight to the project question. What happens when I restructure my 8th grade civics course around Socratic Seminar and other student facilitated discussion protocols? In addition to my research question, I identified 4 main sources of data. I would keep a teaching journal, regularly survey my students, record and analyze videos of Socratic seminars, and track scores on co-created rubrics. But before we look at the data, I thought we should pause for a moment to really look at what exactly a Socratic seminar is. So some basic things to start out. First of all, Socratic seminars are not a new concept by any means. The theory behind the methodology goes back to ancient Greece, hence the name. It could be argued that they are overused in some spaces at the university level, for example. But my experience has shown that seminars have a lot of use at the middle and high school levels. 3 things really stand out to me as important. They're student-centered, they focus on a shared text in question, and they're facilitated by students. So how do they work in my class? I'll show you. Okay, so seminars take place in 2 rounds. During round 1, an inside circle discusses the text led by a facilitator. While the inside circle holds their round of seminar, an outside circle observes. Students in the outside circle take notes on what they're seeing during seminar. After the inside circle finishes their discussion, it depends, it could be 15 minutes, maybe a little longer, maybe shorter, depending on how much time we have in class. But after they finish, they meet with a member of the outside circle for a coaching break. Students discuss glows and grows, what went well and what could be improved. They also might share questions or ideas for what should be brought up in the second round of seminar. Students then switch positions and roles. The outside circle is now the inside circle, ready to take part in their own round of seminar. After everything's done, students write an argumentative paragraph responding to our driving question. They use evidence from the text and their seminar discussion to support a claim. And we followed this basic plan for seminar for most of Q2 this school year, and it was successful, but I wanted to see if I could increase student ownership in class even more, which brings me to the next step of our evolution. That's right, co-scoring. We wouldn't just be sharing responsibility for our class discussions, we'd all be accountable for how they went. And here's how we did it. When we started doing seminar, I kept a basic tally on a notepad of how many times each student spoke. Sometimes I would also script the seminar, writing down what students said to refer back to it later. Once a student asked me if they could tally participation on the board. This helps students see how often they spoke, positively impacting the percentage of the class who took part in the discussions. But still, I thought we could take things a little bit further. Although students were starting to hold themselves and one another accountable for the number of times they spoke, they weren't necessarily maintaining the quality of discussion. Luckily, we had somewhere to turn. Earlier in the school year, we agreed on a set of norms we could use during seminar and other discussions. And students came up with the norms themselves. though the ones I'm about to show you have been wordsmithed a little bit. And we use these norms to create a rubric that looks just like this. So what you see on the screen was created by students, feedback I got from them about how they wanted to run this type of discussion, and we plugged it in here, and then I'll talk to you about the points here. So our norms focused on the right-hand side, you can see them on 5 different categories: respect for each other, respect for the circle, patience, mindfulness, and body language. They range from simple things like one mic, which is just a reminder for students not to talk over one another, to more complex things like challenging ideas, not people. And you can see the rubrics, a 10-point rubric. Students receive 6 points for following the class norms and can earn another 4 points for participating in seminar. And this was really contributed to a major step forward to our class discussions. In terms of successes, the co-created rubric was a clear indicator that students saw themselves as co-facilitators of class. I can't co-create a rubric unless they're invested in that way. It also allowed me to give immediate feedback to students. What's more, it drew a clear connection between what we did in seminar and the norms we created earlier in the year. There were some limitations, and there are some limitations. There's stuff I'm still working on. It's connected to the agreements in theory, but functionally, it only really showed the quantity of student participation. I also found that while there is a space for the teacher, that's me, to write feedback, it's impossible to capture all instances of positive participation. This might not be too much of a problem for class, but it is a problem for me as a researcher trying to capture data. But speaking of data, you can see 2 charts now on the slide, which represent what I was able to collect from the rubrics. The first chart, the one on the top, shows the grade for each student in one section of 8th grade civics for one seminar on that 10-point scale. The pie chart below indicates the percentage of students across both 8th grade classes who received each score. And I drew 2 main interpretations from this. First of all, about 75% of students are scoring a B or above in the seminar grade, which is good. However, I can't really say anything about the types of participation we saw in seminar based on this data alone. So I needed another way to study my students' growth as co-facilitators of class. With this in mind, I started recording seminars with video so I could go back and analyze what was actually happening. I also realized I needed to be a little bit clearer in terms of what I actually hoped to see. I asked myself, what's the goal of the civics class? The new CPS curriculum is designed to help students become what they call powerful civic actors, okay? Basically active participants in US democracy. I needed a working definition for what exactly democratic participation looked like, both in class and in the outside world. I defined democratic participation in the following way. If democracy is government by the people of a country, then democratic participation must be participation driven by and supported by the people of a classroom, the students. So what does democratic participation look like? During my research, I came across a 2016 article by Mary Davenport on Edutopia. Davenport identified a number of elements important to Socratic seminars. I chose 4 to focus on in my classroom. And those are student ownership, deep thinking, critical questioning, and community focus. So I want to take you through one example seminar and see how I analyzed the student video. The seminar we're going to be looking at took place in my grade 8 civics class on March 15th, 2022. Students read and annotated an article from the New York Times and discussed this question. What does Texas Governor Abbott's directive related to transgender adolescents tell you about the relationship between public policy and concepts such as identity, community, and the common good? How well did our class function as a democratic society? Well, let's take a look. The first component of democratic participation I wanted to focus on was student ownership. When looking for student ownership of seminar, I wanted to see whether or not students were asking questions, whether or not they responded to one another without teacher prompting, and whether or not students chose when to discuss and when to move on. All right, so let's roll the tape. Let me get rid of this here. Okay, all right, let's roll the tape.
What evidence do they have for this huge claim / accusation against the LGBTQIA community /
This huge claim? Yeah, they're saying stuff with you.
So in the text on page 3, I think paragraph 2, it says challenge the legitimacy of the investigation and power of the government to change the definition of child abuse. So I think that he's saying that it's child abuse, but he wants to change the definition of it so that it's, we all know child
Fitting
abuse.
his claim.
Yes, so it basically supports his claim and says like, oh yeah, it is child abuse, but he's trying to change it to make it look like he's right.
I think something that also supports that is on page 6 in the 3rd paragraph. It says legislation to ban gender-affirming treatment for teenagers has been introduced in more than 20 states, including Texas, and no such bills have been passed during their last legislative season. And it also says one of the bills would have redefined child abuse to include gender-affirming treatment for transgender treatment, which is like basically proving that they're like actually trying to change the definition of child abuse to like fit their opinion. And it also said that studies have found that transgender teenagers are at a higher risk of suicide. So really, if you think about it, like what they're doing is the only form of like child negligence, but like what kind of negligence? Like to a whole like state of children.
So let's see what we saw here. Okay, we saw one student ask a general question. Another student reacted to the question, and a third student clarified the question. We also saw a student attempt to answer that question, and a 5th student build off of the previous student's answer with further inference. All of this with no interruptions for me. So far, so good. So let's look next at the community focus component here. So for my purposes, community focus was when students used actions or words in seminar to encourage the class to follow seminar agreements, work together, help one another, and take part in the discussion. This one's quick, but it's there. So let's see if we can see it.
Ava, America, or something.
Okay, so what did we see? Quick, like I said, did you catch it? We did see one student invite students who haven't spoken yet to participate. She's legitimately concerned, A, that they're able to share their ideas, and B, that they're able to get their grade. Community focus. We're going to see other instances of that as the video continues, but now let's turn to my next code, which was deep thinking. So people living in a democracy must be willing and able to think deeply about issues impacting their community. If they don't, they may only come up with superficial solutions to problems. Students demonstrate deep thinking through argument creation, argument support, and questioning another student's position. Let's go back to the tape and see what they do in this section.
What you said also on
Page 6.
Yeah, page 6. And the 5th paragraph, it says the agency also removes information about gender identity and about suicide prevention hotlines from its website after one of Mr. Abbott's Republican primary opponents, Don Huffins, attacked the government for promoting transgender sexual policies to Texas youth. I feel like he's kind of trying to sit up high and trying to please other officials with this homophobic and transphobic rule. And like, he knows it's wrong, but he's trying to make it seem as if he's this all-powerful person, and he's trying to get up there with the other powerful people.
Okay, so what do we see again? We saw one student support another student's idea by referring to the text. And we also saw another student help her find her quote that she was looking for. We also heard the first student make an inference based on what she read in the text. And all of this is just building off the ideas that were brought up by the previous student in the prior section of the video. It's showing that deep thinking, this idea that she is supporting that argument. Okay, so we've seen student ownership, we have community focus, we have deep thinking. Let's see if we can also catch students engaging in critical questioning. So I think of critical questioning as very similar to deep thinking, but on the questioning side of things. This includes the drive to understand the ideas of others, peers, and any source we're analyzing, but also it's important to note that critical questioning benefits the whole community. Students aren't just asking for themselves, but to help their peers understand. Let's watch this last snippet here.
One question that I had with the text, it's because it says on page 3, it says, would all licensed professionals who have direct contact with children would be required to report to state authorities those that they believe are receiving gender-affirming treatment or face criminal penalties? What are the penalties? Like, say that happens to you, Like what's the penalty? How harsh is it?
I mean, I'd assume it'll fall under the penalties of child abuse.
Like
Yeah.
what are those?
I don't
It's
know.
changing a lot.
Bail
I
time?
feel like with that penalty, there's already enough with the trans community and also the LGBTQIA community as far as them not being able to do the normal necessities as an individual who is a citizen under the rights.
I think so, guys.
Okay, check it out. So in this clip, we saw a student read a quote. He then asked a question based on that quote, looking for more information. We also hear one student offer an inferred response. The question asker returned his question. A third student actually challenged the inference made by another student. And finally, a fourth student offers another inference. So we've got a lot going on here in this short snippet. This type of questioning drives the entire group toward deeper understanding and ultimately further exploration. And you do hear me start to step in at the end because our source just did not provide students enough information to answer the question. The question actually challenged me as a teacher, opening the door for more learning beyond the scope of the lesson as planned, which is wonderful. After watching and coding videos like this one, I had powerful evidence that not only were more students participating more frequently during seminar than they would during a normal civics class, but they were doing so in a way that developed democratic participation. And just like I did with the rubric data before, I turned what I observed in the video into charts. So let's check those out. So this first one is I call quantity versus quality. The blue on this chart reflects student scores on the co-created rubric, a 10-point scale. And this is all from the seminar that you just watched, okay? As we saw before, about 75% of students are scoring at least an 8 out of 10, which is a B or above. That indicates that they likely participated at least 2 times if they're scoring an 8 out of 10. The red line, however, shows instances of democratic participation. That's student ownership, community focus, deep thinking, and critical questioning. We're able to see what exactly each student put into our discussion, whether or not they were just participating to get their points, or whether they were trying to dig into the reading and the issues, seeking deeper understanding. I've got one more chart, but this time we're going to focus on how frequently each type of democratic participation appeared in our example seminar. So there are some clear wins here. I was able to observe lots of community focus and student ownership. That students really did seem to care whether or not they were all able to participate. There's also evidence that deep thinking went on during this seminar, as we saw in that brief clip. But there is definitely room for improvement. I did not observe nearly as many instances of critical questioning as I did the other codes. Part of this is likely natural. Questions should be less common in conversation than other forms of participation, but it does offer some opportunity for improvement. So, okay, we've seen 8th grade seminars in action. You've heard how I think things went, but what about my students? What did they think? They must have been tired of me asking them what they thought about Socratic seminars, but I did slip one last question into their end of course survey. Write about your experiences with Socratic seminar this year. I wanted to keep the question wide open just to see what they'd say, and they didn't, again, disappoint. Students talked about how much they enjoyed leading class, why it was important for them to be able to process information by talking, and how they thought their experience in seminar might prepare them to have difficult conversations as they got older. Students also offered advice. One recommended that I reduce the writing requirement, while another pushed me to give students more space to share personal knowledge and opinions. Selfishly, though, my favorite one comes from a student who really disliked speaking in seminars earlier in the year. In her end of course survey, she noted that she felt supported by me as her teacher and felt proud that she was able to overcome her dislike of the format. She also gave me flowers and a really nice card at 8th grade graduation. Just in case anybody's worrying, turns out the kids, they're okay. So some findings. 1, students are more likely to participate when given control of class discussion. Data from student-created participation trackers and my coding of class videos show a clear correlation between student facilitation and both quantity and quality of student participation. 2, when students evaluate the quality of their participation, it is likely to improve. When students reviewed data showing the quantity and quality of their participation during Socratic seminar, they identified ways they could specifically improve and strategies to become more involved. Specifically, students noted that they needed to focus on creating more open-ended questions. 3, students are more likely to participate when they perceive topics to be of high interest and carry real-world relevancy. Although class participation improved overall after we restructured class around Socratic Seminar, both the quantity and quality of student participation was notably better when the subject was high interest and relevant to students' experiences, such as the Texas Governor's Directive and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. This was most apparent when considering the participation of students who typically do not speak up much during class. 4, students were more likely to give meaningful feedback about learning protocols and class content when empowered to facilitate Socratic seminars and other discussion protocols. They were more comfortable bringing up possible improvements in class surveys from the start, but became increasingly forward when it came to sharing ideas as we continued to use Socratic Seminar. I also changed. I began to actively invite students' feedback and encourage it to continue. And finally, students who regularly engaged in Socratic Seminar were eager to try other student-led discussion protocols inside the classroom and out. The vast majority of students enjoyed engaging with Socratic Seminar. Even the ones who did not, however, showed an increased willingness to participate in other student-facilitated discussion protocols, including talking circles, philosophical chairs, and moot courts. So I have a coda for you, and I call it Transferring Democratic Participation to the Real World. Students didn't just use the seminar protocol in civics. They took the skills used in seminar, text analysis, facilitation, questioning, and so on outside the classroom. Many of my civics students decided to join our school's student voice committee. Here's our student design shirt, which I'm also rocking here during this presentation. That's the student leadership team, which sends 2 representatives to every local school council meeting. This year, students decided to use our Socratic Seminar protocol to hold a text-based discussion with our school principal. Our shared text, the results of our school's 5 Essentials survey. The 5 Essentials survey is produced by the University of Chicago and is given at every CPS school. It asks participants to rate their school in 5 categories: effective leaders, collaborative teachers, ambitious instruction, supportive environment, and involved families. The students chose the supportive environment category as their focus. They dug deeper, finding that students had rated Mitchell as weak when it came to emotional health. Students held a seminar with our principal, asking questions and bringing up data just like they would in class. Afterwards, they wrote a grant application requesting money from CPS to fund the creation of a safe space where students go when they needed time to reflect or process. And you can see some photos of what came from that here. They decorated the space with art. We built a high table so that students could look out that big, beautiful window there, and stocked it with activities they felt would help students de-stress. They left a physical legacy that benefits all future Mitchell middle schoolers. If that's not democratic participation, I really don't know what is. And all of this was possible just because students took ownership over the process, just like they did in class. I believe that this research suggests a few key actions that could be taken by teachers, administrators, schools, and districts to improve student learning. First of all, for teachers, we must be willing to share power with our students and, more importantly, experience discomfort as students learn to facilitate discussions. Administrators, meanwhile, must give grace in their evaluation of teachers who are attempting to integrate student-led discussion protocols into their pedagogical approach. Schools must prioritize professional development opportunities for their teachers that enable them to incorporate student-led discussion protocols into their curriculum. They must also identify other opportunities for students to use their voices at school, such as that student voice committee example that I showed you, and so on. And finally, districts must not only develop high-quality curricula for use in the classrooms, but also high-quality approaches to teaching. Curriculum, after all, is only as powerful as the way it is delivered. By moving away from traditional methods of teaching, not only will we improve the quality of students' learning experience while at school, we'll also better prepare them to be the democratic participants, the civic actors our society so desperately needs. Thank you so much for listening and imagining with me. I'll take any questions you have.
I think we all feel super revved up after that. I'd say if this was the bar, you did just fine. You did well. Going to bring the mood maybe down a little bit right away, though. You ended on such a high note. An audience member had a question about resistance to this kind of work. And that's a really important question when we think about the reality of doing this work Why do you think that there is so much resistance that we see in schools, and whether it's like in classrooms all the way out to schools, all the way out to districts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, to giving students more input and control over school experiences?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of answers to that question, but I think the biggest one is, I think it's just baked into the model. You know, we're still teaching in this system that was beginning to be designed in the 1800s, and we have taken steps. We have made a lot of progress, but here I am in 2022 talking about a methodology Socratic seminar that's been around for quite some time and trying to encourage people to use it. I think that teachers are time poor and resource poor. I think that, like I mentioned in the presentation, the emphasis at the district level is often, and also from outside organizations, is often the creation of curricula, not how that curricula is rolled or curriculum are rolled out in the classroom. And I think that could be kind of an easy way for us to level up, real easy. But you know, if a district is providing curriculum, they should also provide training to the teachers in terms of how they should teach it, and just not make it a teacher talking the entire time, which is what I think a lot of things are.
Thank you. As you are thinking of a question, because I'm going to ask that we, in the spirit of Socratic seminars, that people have an opportunity to share out rather than me talking at the end. As you're thinking of a question, take a look at Sarah's feedback form, our final feedback form of the evening. I know that all 4 of our presenters tonight would really appreciate feedback from all of us. I am now going to open it up. What questions do you have for Nate?
It's okay, people are tired. It's the end of the day. It's the end of the school year, for crying out loud.
Let me make that, I guess a Socratic seminar wouldn't usually give people only one option. So questions, connections, responses, kudos. Deb?
Though I worked with you all year, it just popped into my head. Did you ever get any pushback about some of the subjects that you were having students talk about at all from parents or other worried administrators?
I mean, the problem with the world that we live in is it's incredibly complicated, and there's so many things that aren't appropriate for anybody that are happening in the world. You know, Deb, you mentioned some the shooting earlier and things like that. That's not something I want to talk about with middle schoolers. But I'm blessed that I work in a community, in a city, under an administration that's very supportive of this. Like the district itself is very supportive of trying to teach for racial justice and things like that. So that's baked in, us having those difficult conversations. My principal is very, very supportive of processing the news with students. If I did face any parent pushback, it was pretty easily remedied through conversation with them. And I just know that that's not the case everywhere. A lot of teachers are in districts and areas where they can't have these conversations, or it's more difficult. But I do think that I really do think that by putting things in the hands of students, that will be more able to have those conversations. If it's not just the teacher saying things and it can be interpreted as the teacher just putting their beliefs on the kids, if it's the kids reading a text and pulling their own ideas out of it, and writing their own questions about it, I think that that's the way forward in some areas where this is more difficult.
Thank you, Deb, and thank you, Nate, for that response. What else?
What would you say to students who enjoy having these conversations, but are a little bit more, you know, afraid of talking to their parents about these things? And I say that from firsthand experience, actually.
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, the first thing I do every year, I send out kind of a notice about the direction of the class and just kind of try to make sure parents are aware of what we're talking about. But I do, like, I'll send emails about encouraging parents, like telling them what we're talking about, encouraging them to continue the conversation with their kids. I found that that basic step can help, like just opening lines of communication between teachers and parents is a big step. That way it's not just on the student. But, you know, I think, again, you know, we all have to live in this place, and we're all responsible for making it better. And we're all going to be in conversations that are extremely difficult and uncomfortable very frequently, unfortunately. And so I coach the students to bravely enter that kind of space. You know, we talk about facing history in ourselves as this whole idea of it's not possible to create safe spaces. We need to create brave spaces. And so kind of talking with students about that idea helps a lot too. I hope that answered that. I'm not sure. Okay.
We've been averaging 3 to 4. We're at 3. Yes, it's 7:20, but that means we can sit in silence for 10 more minutes.
That would be just like my community.
Oh my gosh.
111. No, I was just, one comment is that some of our data I noticed was contradictory when you shared out how when students have control over the classroom, they tend to participate more. And I did find a lot of participation in when I was doing the different discussion protocols, but in my community circle, in like 2 out of 4 of my classes, they didn't participate, you know, like they just didn't participate more. And they had, I thought, even more control over the conversation then. And I don't know, I just was wondering, what do you think about that contradiction or that different experience that we had, like looking at similar things?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is small sample size, different contexts. I mean, there's some data things going on here. But I think when I say students have control, it's very careful release of control, right? You know, the structures, and I think you have this too. Like there are very clear structures in place that students can rely on in order to have these conversations. It can't possibly just be like, and go discuss. You know, we've got all kinds of supports that get them there. And I think as you continue to work on that, as anybody continues to, like, this is not something I was just like, this is going to work this year, I'm going to put this in place. It's something I've been working on for several years. So I think it's a process. And just like I said, give grace, give yourself grace, ask your administrators for grace. It will work.
What it's worth too, I think that kids, particularly at that age, if they perceive a conversation is supposed to be more personal, it might be harder for them to give themselves permission to talk than if they've got something to focus on. I'm not sure your data is that contradictory at all, really. Both are very valid. So, are there any other questions at all? Okay, so I just, couple words, then let everybody go into the night to either have dinner or go take a walk in this lovely weather or whatever it is that you want to do as we celebrate the end of this year of ARLI. The thread for me to some extent was how everyone tonight talked about really trying to give their students a chance to direct their learning. And it's one of those things that seems so logical and so obvious. And so, well, of course, that's going to help. That you wonder why it doesn't happen more often, more organically. But of course, that involves a teacher, as you know, Nate, you've referred to a few times, letting go of some control, which is tough to do, especially if, as a student, your role, your perception of a teacher was the person who was in the front of the room in charge, directing everything. So one of the things that I think is so wonderful about the ARLI process is that critical friends dynamic that goes on in there, where the teachers who are working together are not only helping each other figure out their research, but they're also, to go back to Andy's gentle push, giving themselves, each other, gentle pushes to take a look at what's going on with you and how you're reacting to what's happening and how you're feeling about students and the work in the classroom. Is there anything you need to maybe think about shifting? And my experience has been that people are pretty much willing to step back and take a look at that when they're surrounded by folks who are supporting them in that endeavor. So I'm sad that next year will be the last year of ARLI, but I'm glad that there is another year of ARLI. And I hope that everybody who is here tonight will come back and see the results of our work next June. And thank you so much to all of you who came out tonight and who presented. And my heart is full. It was wonderful. And I'll see most of you tomorrow night, I think, for a little celebration. And the rest of you have a wonderful summer, and congratulations on making it through a challenging year if you're a teacher or administrator, work in education in some other capacity. Thank you all. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks, all. Good night.
Night, Sarah.
Bye, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.